everyone, or good afternoon, I should say. My name is Kevin Callahan, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the first of 4 seminars sponsored by the Bloomberg American Health Initiative's Evidence Working Group. And the purpose of these seminars is to share with you some advances in data use and also new opportunities for using data in areas of priority for the Bloomberg Initiative. And with that in mind, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jeffrey Grigg, who is, as many of you know, on the faculty at the School of Education, where he is affiliated with the Center for Social Organization of Schools, as well as the Baltimore Education Research Consortium, or BERG. Jeff received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin, and before that, 2 master's degrees, one in sociology and one in educational leadership and policy. And he is a former teacher, high school and middle school teacher, taught English after getting his BA in English from Yale University. So Jeff is going to talk to us today about some unique, interesting data sets that he has helped assemble and uses, and how these were integrated. And I can attest to how challenging it is to integrate data sets across agencies, which is what these data sets are. I have had some experience in trying to integrate data within a single agency, and that is agonizing. So what he has done is no small feat, and he's going to tell us some more about that. So please join me in welcoming Greg to our talk today.
Thank you, Kevin. I should also thank Dr. Stewart for inviting me, and Acola Francis for organizing everything and making sure it all occurred as it's supposed to. It's a pleasure to be here. I always like talking about the sort of work that we're up to, focusing on, particularly on education here in Baltimore City and Baltimore City's youth, with the Baltimore Education Research Consortium. What I aim to do today is to tell you a little bit about what we're on about, what we're trying to accomplish, give you some sense of the sort of trajectory of things, the scope of things, and maybe, hopefully, that will spur some interesting ideas and new directions of places people could go. So, to start, I'll just cover some preliminary things. When we talk about educational data, what is it that we mean? So one of the things that I think it's important to recognize is we now live in a time that's data rich, that's not a secret, but there are lots and lots and lots of data points that schools document about children as a part of their sort of daily interaction with kids. So when we talk about educational data, yes, we're talking about test scores, but we're not even necessarily talking about the test scores that everybody talks about, the accountability test scores that are part of No Child Left Behind and all the annual tests. There also are formative tests, developmental tests, tests of kids who are in kindergarten and their literacy development that are done frequently and so forth. So when we talk about test scores, we're talking about all kinds of test scores. Each of these tests is recorded somewhere, and it's necessary, it's useful to the school's work. Schools also keep track of where their children are, daily attendance, when they arrive, tardiness. Whenever a child is suspended or expelled from school, that has to be recorded and documented. So that's what we mean by behavioral data. There are rosters of children that document the collections of them, who they're spending time with over the course of the day. If you're interested in networking, clustering of children, that's part of routine information. There's lots of fascinating information about enrollment, where you live and where you go to school and how does that correspond. There are records of enrollment. Do you stay at the same school over the course of the year? Do you switch schools? Does your address switch when your school switches? Do you graduate? Do you graduate on time? Do you get promoted to the next grade as we would expect? All of the, even your immunization records are potentially part of educational data because it's the law that children have to be immunized in order to enroll in school, and if they're not immunized, that needs to be documented, and that documentation is part of a portfolio of information about kids that, again, is recorded, documented as part of doing business. It's the course of doing business. And so that's how we get to integrating data. Data integration, what we mean by data integration is the combining, the compiling of information that we call administrative data, or is this the kind of data that I just described. That's information that is recorded, documented, collected as the standard practice, as part of doing business. Okay, this is not information where I, as a researcher, would go and enroll somebody or recruit somebody into this into a study. This is kind of information that an agency, a school district, a health system would document, would record for another purpose that would then be repurposed in order to conduct research. Okay, so this is what I mean. This is what we mean by administrative data as opposed to other forms of data. Now these data, these administrative data, are a potentially rich resource. They're often longitudinal. So we can start to think about the life course of a child or of an individual, different contexts, exposures that people might have over time and how that might contribute to their outcomes. They're often fairly up to date. We keep trying to continue to pull in new data. There are some people in the city who are trying to who would love to see a real-time data system for Baltimore City, where we actually there would be some people who could look up something in real time and get a full data profile of an individual. We are far from that case, but that's the goal, at least among some folks. These data systems, when they start getting put together, they often expand and grow, not only over time to be continually updated, but they grow in scope. I think of them as living things almost. This is not a locked-in enterprise. This is a data set that continually gets updated, continually grows, and as a result, it has to be nurtured. It has to be sustained. It's in some ways very much, I think, a living thing sometimes. These data often include PII, or personally identifiable information. I should be very clear, the analysis is not done on personally identifiable information. The analysis is done on de-identified information, so that PII is stripped out in order to do the analysis. It's entirely unnecessary, so we don't use it. But if you want to compile information about, say, Jeffrey Grigg, from a school district and a doctor's office, there are very few ways other than the name and date of birth and other personally identifiable information to find out if this is the same individual in two different data sets. So that's why personally identifiable information is handled. It is only handled to the amount that it's strictly necessary, but it is necessary. And so as a result, protections for the individuals. FERPA is the federal law that governs educational data, and then HIPAA, of course, is the federal law that governs health data. Both of those laws are invoked when you deal with personally identifiable information, or at least potentially. The other thing comment I want to make very clear is that I myself, as a researcher conducting this sort of enterprise, have offered technical support and assistance, but I never own the data. The data still belong to the agencies. I consider myself and my colleagues as stewards of data who help provide certain insights and certain services, but the data are not ours. The health department data is health department data. It's not Jeff's data, okay? And as a result, the local government agencies, the school districts, the health department are often continually involved all throughout the process. It becomes really a collaboration around the data and around the questions, which has great virtues and admittedly also puts some constraints on somebody in my position as a researcher. Okay, so there are, it would be foolish to suggest that this is not technically challenging. It is. Most of the integration, the matching of records from one source to another is conducted using probabilistic models, or we call them fuzzy matching models. There also are important ways to govern data handling. There are really critical questions about how many matches failed to be performed, why, how, to what extent. Is that what we might expect, or is there a problem? So there are very much technical challenges. The good news is people have figured most of those out. Okay, there's even recently written a wonderful textbook about data linking. Okay, so you can look up how to do this. People are developing R packages to do this. There's SQL language. There's programs written in Stata. So the technical challenges there are solutions for, which I think is important and positive news. So what this is a map from the actionable intelligence of social policy of where in the country there are so-called integrated data systems, because like most good ideas, it's caught on. And this originally, to my knowledge, started in Philadelphia with John Fantuzzo and Dennis Culhane. They created 10 years ago something called KIDS, the KIDS Integrated Data System, which was a Philadelphia-based effort to integrate data across different agencies in Philadelphia that served Philadelphia kids. It's been very successful, and it's since grown into this sort of national network of folks trying to accomplish similar things. And recently, just a month ago, they celebrated their 10th anniversary of trying to create this national network to do this for communities around the country. And they wrote a brief report reflecting on their 10 years, and which really resonated with me, because they had this one quotation. While this may sound like a technical project, and it is, we've found that the development and use of an integrated data system is primarily relational. And what I mean by that is, and what I believe they mean by that, is, for example, consider the work that I'm doing in Baltimore City. It involves children. It involves populations of children. I am a Baltimore City resident. I have young children. I know that at least 2 of my 3 children are in the data that we're developing, okay? It's not somebody's abstract babies. These are my babies, okay? And so that is a powerful responsibility, okay? And that is a powerful opportunity, but it also means that people are rightfully concerned about protecting individuals. They need to be. And the data can only be done for a legitimate purpose, okay? Because if I myself am studying my own children as part of a data enterprise, that raises the stakes, okay? Honestly, it just does. And if you or anybody else is studying data that has my children in it, then that raises the stakes between us, okay? So there are ways to do this, but I always want to remind myself of when you're doing these really exciting things, we're studying populations of communities where you live, where you work, like those are real people. It's not an abstraction in the way that I frankly originally was sort of treated to think of nationally representative samples and things like that. These are place-based efforts, and as a result, they're great opportunities, and they're very exciting. But this is why I believe that this effort, 10 years of reflection from Fantuzzo and Culhane, why they call it a relational enterprise more so than a technical one. And so therefore, this is my speculation, but I don't think it's a surprise that these efforts, these data integration efforts, have developed and have converged on locations that have what are called, at least in education, research practice partnerships. So this is a map of the research practice partnerships that are currently active around the country. We've got Burke represented proudly here. Burke has been operating since 2008, I believe, 2007, I believe. It's been functioning as a partnership between Hopkins, Morgan State University, and the Baltimore City public school system to handle and work with Baltimore City Schools data. It is since what we're doing at Burke now is sort of expanding the scope to think about how the city really is an entity around the kids. And that's really been driving these data integration efforts. These children that we look at over long periods of time, they live in places, they have experiences before school, after school. And so to the extent that we can understand those experiences and how those create and contribute to the set of outcomes that we observe, the better we can do our work. And that, I think, is really why, at least here in Baltimore, why we've been moving into the direction of data integration. Is really to understand the full complement of experiences that children in Baltimore City live during the course of the day, a week, a month, a year. I also think it's one of the reasons why we focus on Baltimore. When you start to scale up the dimensionality of the data, you have to simplify things somehow. And so that's how we manage everything, is by focusing on Baltimore City. And so we focus on Baltimore City, a limited location, and we try to push out the dimensionality of the information, the data. So, so these are the research practice partnerships. You may have noticed that this map looks a lot like the one I just showed you of integrated data systems. Because this is the direction that I think educational research is going in terms of creating rich data structures in partnership with school districts, many of which take the form of an integrated data system. So this, I said before, good ideas are not proprietary, they're shared, they catch on. This integrated data system is currently, we've been developing them at Burke, but there's also one that the state has been developing. The Maryland Longitudinal Data System is actually a Maryland state government entity. It was established by state law in 2010. It's here in Baltimore City. It's just down in the MSD, Maryland State Department of Education building. They're a wonderful staffed unit, and then what they're trying to do is, again, while complying with these regulations about sort of the FERPA and so forth, they are a government agency. They have compiled data from the Maryland State Department of Education. So that's information about mostly K-12 education, elementary and secondary school. I'll skip the next one for a moment. Then there's also the Maryland Higher Education Commission. So that's a post-secondary school, college, and so forth. Then the third component is the Department of Labor Licensing and Regulation, or known as DOLLAR. And that is wage information. And it's all organized and operated through the University of Maryland School of Social Work and the School of College of Education. So they have an integrated data system of secondary school information, college information, and now wage information, following children over the course of, and young adults now, over the course of years, even a decade, okay? And this opportunity allows now for answering what I believe are very compelling questions, okay? So one of the things that my colleague Rachel Durham has been able to do recently, using this integrated data, is to look at how the median annual wages of Baltimore City school students who go on to college or not, and then see what they are. Let's start over again. 6 years after they graduate from high school, Rachel can look and see what they're earning, what their official earnings are. Again, this is gross earnings. And combine that with information about their college attendance. So she recently published this brief, which has what I find to be really amazing and sobering information. These are children who graduated from high school in 2009. They have a Baltimore City degree. And then 6 years later, in 2015, how much money did they make? What was their median income? And this is of children who reported some income. I call them children, they're adults now. Adults who reported some income. What was the median wage? Okay? Gross wage, mind you. And this is what Rachel found. Yes, there is a gradient to education, which we would expect. It's actually higher for students with a 2-year degree, an associate's degree or certificate. The median income for young people who reported wages was $22,000 a year, gross. If 6 years after graduating from high school, if they held a bachelor's degree, their income was $19,000. And if the students who did not go on to college, for example, they're over here, they had, they had $13,000 gross wages, okay? This is something that we didn't know before about Baltimore City graduates. I find it alarming, a call to action. Because all of these numbers are remarkably low. This is population information, the whole graduating class of 2009. And provided that these young people stayed in the state of Maryland and had some sort of official revenue and didn't work for the federal government, this is the information that they provided to the state, and the state in its function as keeping track of wages integrated this data together with information about whether or not young people went to college, what kind of degree they got, and so forth. And the population of Baltimore City high school graduates could be identified, and therefore these things get put together and start to answer questions like this. And then, of course, raise more questions like this. I would love to know, are these people fully employed? How many jobs are they having? What is their hourly wage, and so forth? So in some ways this is tantalizing. We only know so much, but it's certainly much more than we ever knew before. So one of the enterprises so this is about post-secondary outcomes after young people graduate from high school. The other sort of scope, stage of life that we work in a lot, and that I personally am involved in, is with early childhood. There's a lot that happens, as we know, between birth and the kindergarten entry. So we know that a lot happens, but we do not know a lot about what happens. We don't know really very much about how families navigate the landscape between having a little baby, and how they then get their 2-year-old taken care of, their 3-year-old, their 4-year-old. Once you get to be age 5, then okay, the answer is simple. You go to kindergarten. That's the law. But what do you do in that space in between? We know it's really critical. We know it's potentially highly influential on these little plastic minds. But how does the system all fit together? So that's under the leadership of Faith Connolly at Burke many years ago, and with the financial support of the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation, we brought together a number of partners to create what we call the Early Education Data Collaborative, or the EEDC. And what this does is it takes cohorts of Baltimore-born children, the population defined by birth records kept by the vital statistics, birth certificates. These information are kept by the state of Maryland and by the Baltimore City Health Department. So that's really the foundation that we build off of. And then to that foundation, we add as much information as we can from the administrative records of agencies that are serving families and children prior to kindergarten entry. So for example, we have some information about home visiting, visits made to mothers of very young children. Head Start is a federally funded program that serves 3 and 4-year-old children. So we have a partnership with them, Baltimore City Head Start. We have their administrative records. We have some information from Baltimore Infants and Toddlers program, which is a statewide program. You may have heard of an IEP, or an individualized education plan for special education. This is an IFSP, which I think it's Individualized Family Support Plan. It's essentially an IEP for children under age 5. There's a whole effort to identify and serve children who may have special needs, who are that young. I had no idea about it. And it's a really critical and important service that's provided to children and families in the city. And then we have information from Baltimore City Public Schools, enrollments in pre-K, kindergarten, and also some of these test scores, kindergarten readiness, literacy, early developmental literacy. So this is sort of a schematic of how all of these things are supposed to fit together. This next picture is how we trying to illustrate how it actually fits together. So this sort of spaghetti picture tries to illustrate the myriad ways in which families and children navigate the early childhood environment and ultimately enter schooling in Baltimore City, okay? So we have a population of children who are born in the city, and then if we can match them to any of these other agencies, we count them in one of the bubbles, and then we draw the arrows to connect them. And so you can see that there are some sort of more popular, more prominent arrows, but there's also, it's a picture of a huge amount of complexity. Another thing that it became very apparent to us, and it's important, became very apparent, was that there's a great discrepancy between the number of children who were born each year in Baltimore City. In this case, it was nearly 10,000. And the number of those children that we observed later on in kindergarten, in the enrollment records. There's nearly over 3,000 children every year that we cannot match, we cannot find later on. And now, mind you, some of that is due to error, but I'm not missing 3,000 cases every year. There's something else going on. There are not. The average sort of kindergarten classroom, or kindergarten grade level is about 7,500 students. So we have, that alone shows this big discrepancy. So this is the sort of thing that we can start to do with the data once we start tying it all together. And then we can start asking the kinds of questions that the agencies themselves ask. Like, if I serve 2,000 or 3,000 3-year-olds every year, what happens to them? These are very fundamental questions. 2 years from now, how do they do when they enter kindergarten? Because I don't know. There's no mechanism. There's no feedback. And so that's really the value we provide, and that's what we try to offer. And so what we also can then do is, this is when we start to get into what I think of as important research. So we can simplify this picture into sort of the modal pathways of children entering kindergarten in Baltimore City. And one of the things that I think is a real value of this kind of work is that in kindergarten, students and families are asked about their prior care, or where they came from. But the way they ask this question only refers to the immediately prior year. And so what this enterprise allowed us to do was recognize that every year there's nearly 1,000 children who enter kindergarten who have had an experience in both Head Start as a 3-year-old and in the Baltimore City pre-K program as a 4-year-old. And then they enter kindergarten. So they have, in some ways you could think of it as almost a double dose of this early childhood preparation. Before we did this, we could never quantify or identify who those children were. So there were a lot of children who were being prepared, served by a Head Start program as a 3-year-old, but they weren't being recognized as entering kindergartners. And so the entering kindergartners who were credited as Head Start students were this pathway, who bypassed pre-K altogether, stayed in Head Start for a second year as a 4-year-old, and then entered kindergarten directly. And so what we argue is that that's a very different group population of kids, and it's important, even critical, to distinguish between the two if you want to then start asking questions about program impacts and optimal pathways of children entering kindergarten. And then, of course, we can do this fairly rigorously because the information in the birth certificates is incredibly rich and has information that we think is really critical, like, did your mother finish high school, and things like that. Things that we know are predictive of child outcomes. We can observe in the birth certificates, and then we can develop matching models and this sort of thing, even multiple treatment and concurrent matching models, to try to untangle these influences and do a fair and rigorous analysis of them. And it's also, this is the part where I get excited because we get to do fancy stuff, statistical stuff. I mentioned, I pointed out the thousands of children every year who we observe born in the city of Baltimore who then we don't see again in kindergarten. And so what we've been doing now, and this is sort of what I think of as a valuable service to the city, is we've been able to sort of identify and describe this population of potential kindergarten enrollees and start to try to get our handle on questions about migration out of the city, who's leaving, from where, and so forth. And so we've been talking with the school system, and what's exciting to me is that after a few conversations about this this phenomena, which is, and based on these evidence, they've been able to think about ways in which they might conduct some outreach and informational campaigns to families to encourage them to consider their options within the city. So that's been sort of a fun collaboration and a way in which this information can provide sort of actionable value back to the folks we got it from, they got the data from. Okay. Another thing that we've been up to, this is with my colleagues Mark Stein and Julia Burdick-Will, thinking a lot about geography and transportation and using, combining publicly available information with proprietary schools information. So the public information on this enterprise, which has been supported by the Spencer Foundation, is, for example, the GTFS, or General Transit Feed Specification information on how all the buses are supposed to navigate the city. Julia Burdick-Will is an expert on violence exposure. Baltimore City publishes all of its victim-based crime calls on a great detail, great richness, so she can pull in these data, and we can start to ask questions about, like, does the way in which you get to school, how does it, and is that associated with whether you get to school or how often you get to school? Is the navigating a potentially violent environment, is that related? Does that interact with how you get to school, the transit options that are available to you? And it also allows us to sort of, again, quantify and portray the nature of living in the city as a young person. All right, so this map here shows the time it takes to get to school on a bus to the four selective high schools in the city: Pauley, Western City, and Dunbar, which is right near here. what it shows is that if you live in certain parts of the city, the bus pass that they provide you to get to the school of your choice that you've been selected for, there are some places where you can live, and it doesn't matter where you're going, but all three of these attractive options are going to take you a very long time. And this is assuming that the reality that kids experience reflects what the schedule says. Okay, so I find this movement into compiling, taking advantage of publicly available data really exciting, and thinking of ways in which the publicly available data can be integrated into these information about individual kids, again, to get a better understanding of what their experiences are on meaningful educational outcomes. So at this point, you might be asking, what's the explicit connection to public health? And that would be a fair question. So one of the enterprises that I'm involved with collaborators here at Public Health, Heather Volk and Rochelle Musi, is we're calling lead exposures and educational outcomes, a population study. It's supported by the Johns Hopkins Discovery Initiative. And so what we're trying to incorporate over the course of this year, and this is a direct offshoot of the early childhood work I was just describing. It involves many of the same people. This was an idea that was generated by that effort. And what we're trying to do is integrate three sources of information. Birth records held by the Baltimore City Health Department, lead testing information for young people, blood lead levels that is now at the Baltimore City Health Department in collaboration with the Maryland Department of the Environment, and then school records provided by Baltimore City Public Schools. And what we're trying to do is tie these data sources together to get a better understanding of how birth circumstances and early childhood lead exposure prior to 24 months or later, depending on how the testing is going, and subsequent educational outcomes are related. And so our initial question will be whether if we can identify similar children at birth who vary based on their lead exposure as a child, is that related to the likelihood that they would be suspended or expelled from school. And then there's also, of course, once we tackle that, there's lots of other subsequent outcomes, educational outcomes that a person would justifiably be interested in. So we're very excited about this. It doesn't exist yet. We're still in the process of getting all the necessary approvals, but there's great support from everybody involved, and I'm optimistic that by the end of the school year, we'll actually have a real viable data set to answer this particular set of questions. So this is a very exciting thing for me, especially because it involves collaboration with folks over here at the School of Public Health and in Medicine. Okay, so in summary, there are advantages and constraints or limitations, but I think, in my view, the advantages are take the day. So one of the things that's very exciting about working with these kind of data is that it's population level data. So, I spend a fair amount of time talking about p-values and sampling and statistical inference. Well, there's a different set of rules when you have the population. So we've got very extensive population data. It's often unique, which sort of appeals to me. Nobody else has this. There is an eager and ready audience with a natural connection to actually doing something. And the questions and the ownership are jointly negotiated, so this is not a solitary enterprise. I find all of those things appealing. There are, however, limitations. One is that we're limited to the use of administrative data. So as a result, you can only use data that have already been collected. There is no going back to essentially crack the code and follow up with people. Or if you did, you'd be operating under a whole different paradigm, a whole different set of rules. And admittedly, there is, because these things are jointly negotiated, there is less autonomy as a researcher. This is not the paradigm that I was essentially trained on, which was you extract data from a population in the form of a sample, and you do what you wish with it. This is an ongoing, sustained relationship. And one I find very rewarding, and one I think allows opportunities to do things that are rare at best, if not unique. But it's also very careful to recognize, to take care of where the sustenance comes from, okay? Because this is an ongoing relationship, and so it needs to be treated as such. It is not a sort of classic example of a nationally renowned researcher parachuting into a location and getting what he or she needs from it, and then moving on to the next spot. It's always returning to the same spot, and so as a result, I think there is a relationship, first of all, which I think is important and sustaining and valuable, but it also means that you have to recognize that relationship, okay? So that's what we mean by integrating educational data here in Baltimore, and also it's being done other places around the country. I think I've more or less reached the time for questions. Again, we're up at I'm at Burke in the School of Education, which is up on Charles Street, just at the southern tip of the Homewood campus. So thanks very much. I really appreciate your time and attention. And please, I hope you have questions, and I look forward to doing my best to answer them. Thank you.
And Jeff, if you could just repeat the questions.
Yes, I will.
For the benefit of those who are watching the webcast.
Thank you. And is there a way to get questions from the? No.
No.
All right, so it falls on you guys to ask all the good questions.
I'll start, and I think it is. You talked about having population data, Jeff, and it is remarkable that you have records for all the newborns in Baltimore, which is pretty amazing. But then you said, a lot of that, you're only about 75%. By the time you get to kindergarten, you've got maybe 7,000 out of the 10,000.
Yeah.
You said some of that is probably due to error.
Yes.
Are there any other reasons that you've identified? I would imagine some move out of the area. That might be part of it.
Yes. So this is so the question was about the 3,000 children every year who we do not observe, do not successfully see again. It's a really critical question: is where are they? What's going on? As I see it, there are 3 possible explanations, and we're trying to sort of quantify each of them. Error is certainly part of it. We do not successfully match every single case. For example, as the population of native Spanish speakers or Spanish-speaking children grows in Baltimore City, the way people handle multiple names, my example would be Gabriel Garcia Marquez, right? Is Garcia Marquez his full surname? Is Garcia his middle name? Different agencies, even the same agency from one time to the next might use a different set of decision rules. So we are concerned about error and bias, and from what I can tell, maybe about 10%, as much as 10% of kids are lost to error, because we have some data sets that should be almost contemporaneous with the birth records, and we can match about 90% of those kids. The second, in the context of schooling, everybody talks about private schools. Well, they're going to private school. And yes, they are, but the private sector is not absorbing 2,000 or 3,000 children every year. There are not that many private school seats in the immediate region of Baltimore, and many of those seats are filled by children from the county and other places. So yes, there is private school. as a loss in terms of loss to follow-up. But they also don't explain the whole, the magnitude of that number. Again, so we're left with migration, and which gets at a very sort of visceral Baltimore issue about population and population loss and migration and aging of population. And so I spend a fair amount of time talking to folks in the city now about these issues, these demographic issues, because I believe that the only explanation for that many children every year not appearing later in kindergarten is people are leaving. And we can start to describe who those people are and where they live and at least identify the phenomenon. But it is those are the three things: error, missing a match, the private sector or homeschooling. But again, it doesn't explain the magnitude, and then migration, people leaving. Yes.
Just to follow up on that, do you have the information for which hospitals those babies are born at, and if it's systematically one hospital or not?
So the question was about information about the hospitals children were born in. I'm glad you asked that question. So the answer is no. We don't. The information that we have available to us does not include the hospital. The population is based on mother's residence at the time of birth. So if a child was Baltimore City, the mother was a Baltimore City resident, but the delivery occurred in Catonsville or somewhere else, then they would be in the data set. And conversely, if a mother came from the county, for example, and was born here at Hopkins, they would not be in the data set. But that information is not available to me. And the reason it's not available primarily is because we didn't know to ask for it at the time. One of the real tricks to this sort of undertaking is to know what's available so you can ask for it. And then if you know who to ask for it, who's in a position to approve it, then that's even better. But I find this sort of occasional comes up quite frequently, where there's information that's collected, and if somebody different had been involved at the time we were making the initial request for the variables, then maybe that would have been added to the list. Or there's information that comes to light along the way that then we say, oh, it'd be very interesting to get that. So for example, the APGAR score for every birth, that's recorded, that's documented, and that's on the birth certificate, but we didn't know we didn't know to ask for it at the time. So in the next iteration of this, I'll get approval for APGAR scores, and I expect it will be granted. But nobody will give us something that we didn't ask for. And so we need to, again, be informed enough about the landscape to know what's out there to be asked for. Yes, question?
Staying with the theme of the early childhood data collaborative.
Yeah.
The next iteration, what does that look like? Or are you still adding cohorts beyond 08?
So yes, the question was about the sort of the future of the early education data collaborative. I'm happy to say it. I believe it has a future. We started with an initial cohort of children who were entering kindergarten in 2013. Those children keep getting older and older. So I think now they're fourth graders, maybe? Fourth or fifth grade. We had, in the initial push, we did this exercise with 4 cohorts of children consecutively. So it was children born between 2007 and 2011. But we'd like to continue to refresh the information to look at cohorts who have entered kindergarten more recently. So yes, we're mostly, I believe, have kind of settled on an equilibrium for the kind of information we have, but we're trying to keep it up to date with subsequent cohorts of kids. So that's really the future of it. And again, I mentioned earlier, there are folks who would like a real-time system. Like we're doing our best. We're trying to get more up to date. But, when you're in a position at an agency to make, say, a funding decision about something, when I go up and I talk about kids who are entering kindergarten 4 years ago, which is really the group that I can talk about most confidently, that has some utility, but you could imagine why somebody would want okay, but since then we tried something new, this new strategy or whatnot, has that made a difference? How do the kids who are entering now compare to the kids entering then? So there is a demand to sort of keep this thing up to date. So in that way, it is an ongoing enterprise. Yes, please.
So I'm wondering, when you start a project, why you didn't include the population in the county? So because I imagine that people who have their kid in the city probably will consider move to the county at some point when it's getting older.
So the question was about essentially the scope and the limit to the city. Because absolutely, people move back and forth between the city and the county. Some people do both. They'll move to the county in 1 year, and then 2 years later, they'll come back. And of course, there's more than one county surrounding Baltimore. There's Anne Arundel County, there's Baltimore County, there's Montgomery County, there's Howard County. So that's one of the reasons, one of the virtues of taking a state level approach, because then your population will include children, as long as they stay in, say, public schooling, they'll be in any of the school districts in the county, in any of the counties. We have sometimes successfully for targeted questions. So, for example, with Julie Burdick-Will, we have created an integrated enrollment between Baltimore City and Baltimore County, which involves parties on both sides. There are questions about shared children and migration between the city and the county. I would very much like to broaden the scope, but then we get there's a compromise, I think, in terms of the detailed program information. Not only the kinds of programs that are available, but also what you can know about them. There's some, but yeah, they're very successful. There's one here in Maryland, an integrated data system at the state level. Many other states have them. The kinds of questions you can ask at, say, the state level might differ from the city level. The audience might be different, but yeah, they're absolutely the counties. All of the counties that people move to are part of the story, and currently are not, or should be part of the story, and currently are not. Any question? Yeah.
Do you have I'm thinking back to your, I guess, hypothesis that migration has a lot to do with the differences in population numbers over time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a way of potentially tracking that information with tax information, residential information, if you have the...
Not now. Sorry. The question was about identifying migration over time from these babies who are born and then finding out where they go. And I think it would be possible, but we currently do not have really much traction, because are we following, say, mothers, a population of mothers as they move around the state? Are we following children? But yeah, it should be possible. Then the question is, again, who's the person who would approve it? How do you ask for it? And who is in a position to really want to know the answer to that question? Now, this particular question, I think there are a lot of people who would like to know. Both the city, Baltimore City, would like to know where its people are going, and also some of the surrounding communities would like to know where their people are coming from. So I think there would be a sort of a state role to kind of understand this migration. Most right now, the existing state data infrastructure is on young adults and post-secondary outcomes and wage outcomes, but would hope to see a sort of a statewide version of this early childhood system, maybe someday. Yeah, because then you could really get some traction on some of these questions. Yes, question.
As I listen to your talk and your data set, it's all really interesting. I think it's very powerful. But I think having lived in Baltimore now for 5 or 6 years, and I'm also living in a community with a lot of disparities in it, and then just the story of Hopkins in general, I wonder how are you using the data to actually empower local communities in understanding what benefits or lack of benefits their local school brings them?
Yeah.
And how to really respond to the environment that their child is entering into.
Right. And I'm the white guy from Hopkins who's starting to study lead. Right. I mean, this is real stuff. These are real Baltimore questions. It's part of, I think, honoring and respecting that the data come from people. These are people in our community. I personally am continually challenged by our partners in the health department and the school district, to address this very question. How do we make this enterprise, which uses information about people, valuable to them? Especially, so we've been thinking a lot about that in terms of this lead study. And working very closely with the health department to mount sort of informational campaigns and things like that, to give people, if they hear about this, to also couple that with information about what they might do, information where they might go for more information, things like that. And in the context of schooling, it's a tricky question. I frankly find most of the models of like effective schools and so forth to be lacking, and so and I also think that people generally are the best judges of what's appropriate for them and their schools, and if they are unhappy with their school, they don't need me to tell them that they should be. But we do I think have a responsibility to not just benefit from these things, but also give benefit from them. So I appreciate your question. I'd like to have a sort of really clear example. I think in some of the early childhood space, there's emerging evidence of what sort of the optimal preparation for kids would be, so we can both advocate for that and for funding that configuration at one level, and think about how we might encourage people to make their opportunities available to them for their own children. Because as you can see, like navigating that system is a mess, and there is no handbook. As a parent of a young child, it's like you don't really know what you're supposed to do. So I think one of the things I'd like to do is try to keep those parents in mind, and try to give some recommendations and encourage certain things that seem to be beneficial for kids. But yeah, it's a tough question, honestly. I'm glad you asked it. Thank you.
And that's a good final question.
Thank you.
So, thank you all, and one more round of applause.